There is nary a democratically elected politician who doesn't consider public sentiment when it comes to making policy decisions. But we also claim to want politicians who lead and don't just slavishly follow public opinion polls. How to explain this conundrum? Well, here to help us do just that, in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, Tim Powers. He's Vice Chair at Summa Strategies. In Montreal, Quebec, Stuart Soroka. He is Professor of Political Science at McGill University. And with us here in studio, Marie Butriani. She is a former Ontario Cabinet Minister, now the Interim Dean at Ryerson University's G. Raymond Chang School of Continuing Education. And Keith Newman. He's Executive Director at the Environics Institute. And let me welcome you two here to our studios and to our two guests in Points Beyond. We're glad to have you on the program as well. We also want to let our viewing audience know that we want to hear from you on this topic. Our producer, Hilary Clark, and our online producer, Elamine Abdelmahmoud, they are both hosting a Twitter chat right now. So chime in using the hashtag AgendaTVO. Okay, Stuart, going to start with you in Montreal because we heard in Susan Delacourte's interview that the current consumerization, if you like, of our democracy is very troubling to many people. Politicians simply marketing their way into office, sort of chopping up the electorate in little bits and bite sizes that they can buy off with niche politics. But some will say, I thought the basic idea of democracy in the first place was for politicians to do what the people who put them in office wanted them to do. So what's wrong?
Well, I mean, I think it's worth separating between concerns about the way in which campaigns currently work, and then kind of more broader concerns about the way in which politics and policymaking works. And regarding campaigns, I think there are some real concerns right now about the way in which campaigns are structured, the way in which politicians try to seek office. The way in which politics works, though, is a little broader, and there I think there may be fewer concerns, or at least it's more difficult to figure out exactly what the precise concerns are. Generally speaking, in politics, what we want is for politicians to do some combination of proposing policies for people to consider and doing the things that people want them to do. And generally speaking, kind of from 30,000 feet, that seems to kind of function relatively well, looking over the past few decades in Canada. Okay, Tim, let me get you to follow up, because you haven't been necessarily doing this at 30,000 feet. You've had your feet in the trenches for many campaigns in the past. How do you see this relationship and/or balance between democracy and public opinion?
Well, I guess I'd quote the great emancipator, or actually paraphrase him. It's Lincoln who said, with opinion you have everything, without public opinion you have nothing. And if it was good enough for Lincoln, I think it can be good enough for the rest of us. I mean, I think the nature of public opinion is such that you have to connect with the public. You have to figure out what's going on. I think part and parcel of that exercise is getting to understand their wants and their needs. Now, people will say, well, that diminishes the ability of a leader to go against the grain, to champion an idea that may not be politically popular. I think the challenge then is to persuade. Having seen this in action and seeing it now not just in political campaigns, but lobby and advocacy campaigns, you don't succeed unless you do have public opinion. And there is a lot of engagement with the public to get that opinion, to understand where they're coming from. I think generally that is good, because it is not so much as corrosive as it is interrogatory, investigating, trying to understand where they're coming from. If you're doing that, I think that has to be somewhat useful for democracy. Okay, Marie, I think we should follow up on what Stuart pointed out in his first answer, which is let us make the distinction between campaigns where people make all kinds of promises, etc., and actually running the ship, which is what we're more focused on over the next half hour plus in our discussion. In your experience, and you were at the cabinet table, this relationship between trying to do the right thing, which may or may not be the same thing as giving the people what they want, how did it work out for you?
Well, I would agree with Stuart and Tim that I think, generally speaking, the universe unfolds as it should in a democracy like Canada. Overall, we do what the people want us to do. It might be messy and up and down. It may not be, the timing may not be exactly what the people want, but my observation and my experience is we do what the public wants us to do.
But the public is always divided, so how can you do that?
I was just going to say, it goes awry when there is a special interest group, for example, that is not looking at the interests of society as a whole, but is looking at their very narrow interests, that at times that is when it goes awry. And depending on the political party and the relationship leadership of that interest group, then they could be swayed to be doing something that may not be in the best interests of society. But I really believe that those are few and far between examples. I think by and large, when you look at it after the fact, it may be a messy road to get there, but the public usually wins in a democracy.
And in your experience in public life, you're not now more cynical about how this all works itself out, given that you've seen how that sausage gets created behind closed doors?
Well, there are a few bad experiences, but overall, I've been very honored to have had that experience. To actually, the AODA, for example, the Accessibility Act for People with Disabilities, that didn't come from a public outcry. That did come from a group of people that didn't have their human rights realized, but it did come with the support of the general public once the consultations occurred and the other political parties. So there are really good examples of really good things that happened. So I try to think of those more than the others.
Keith, where are you coming from on this?
Well, I'd like to take a little different position on this, and perhaps I think there is more of a concern on the governance side than perhaps Stuart and the others are suggesting. I think in principle what they're saying makes sense. But I think in Canada, you're now starting to see examples where governments, once elected, perhaps are starting to govern to their base. And their base may be a minority group within the broader population. I think you're seeing it with the federal government and some of the policies and approaches that Stephen Harper's taking, which may not reflect broad public opinion, but his particular base. And I think you see it in Toronto, certainly with Rob Ford, and you look at this recent example with the Scarborough subway and so forth. I think you have to ask the question, are the decisions that he's taking and pushing in City Council representing the broad views of Toronto residents or a particular constituency?
You know, Tim, I'm going to get you to follow up on that one, because that is a charge that I think is most frequently made against Conservatives as opposed to people in other parties, which is that you attempt to govern mostly, I guess the way Brian Mulroney put it, you dance with the ones that brung you and you don't tend to worry about anybody else. You think that's a fair rap?
I'm glad you didn't use that Bryce Mackesy quote of Mulroney's. Yeah. That would have taken this in a whole other direction.
I remember that one too, yeah.
Some may say public opinion is that sort of business, but look, I think, yeah, you do dance with the ones who brung you to a large degree, and part and parcel of democracy is going out to the public and finding you're never going to get 50% in this day and age. I suspect you tend to get 40 on the national level who like a certain policy platform and direction, and you go that way. Obviously, during the course of governing, you tend to try to be as pragmatic as possible, but the nature of democracy is it does allow you to wash it all out. As Keith will tell you, and as the others no doubt know, there's also all sorts of things now around micro-targeting, looking at special groups, whether they be special interest, normal established special interest groups, or communities of special interest, and speaking to them and their particular interest. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I don't think that's necessarily something that's exclusive to Conservatives. That's just the reality of the realm in which we live. And as long as people understand that realm and understand that if they're going to advocate for ideas and they're going to push policy, they need to be able to advocate to different interests to bring their ideas forward. I think it's managing pieces of chess on the chessboard.
Stuart, let's do a little cross-border comparison shopping here. I've heard it said that in the United States, public opinion forces policies and institutions to change or do a particular thing, whereas here in Canada, it's the other way around. Our institutions tend to push the public towards change. What's your view?
Well, that mostly fits with my view. It's kind of an awkward time to be talking about how American democracy works a little better than Canadian democracy.
I don't think I said that, and for sure, I don't think that when you look at what's going on down there right now.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, it is true that the American system creates a stronger link between individual representatives and their constituencies. There is stronger what we would call dyadic representation in the United States. And that forces particularly the House to react strongly to the preferences of the public, or at least the preferences of the majorities who elected each of the individuals that finds their way into the House. That's much less so in the Canadian case. In the Canadian case, members of Parliament are much more likely to vote along party lines for a whole variety of reasons. We have a parliamentary system in which the executive tends to hold the majority in the House and thus can't be locked out of policy making. And so you do tend to have a system in the States where public opinion has a little more power.
Okay, Marie, you gave us the example of the disability community, which lobbied hard and had been lobbying hard for a long time to try to get enhancements to their human rights in the province. But that was a special interest group, and I'm not sure if you knew how much of the general public was behind their efforts or even cared about their efforts or whatever. So the question becomes, how do you know when you're trying to get something through, how much of the public is with you and how much of this is just one group making a lot of noise on a particular issue that's of interest to them but may not be of interest to anybody else? And I'm saying that not in being specific to the disability community. There's lots of people who care about that issue, but we know there are lots of other issues where it's a small segment that cares and no one else does.
Yeah, in that particular example, I think that is where the leadership from the government was important, to show why it is to everyone's benefit that people with disabilities deserve their human rights, both for economic reasons as well as for social reasons. But in other cases, it's just knowing the pulse. And I think the Harper government has a good one right now. They're on to the cable companies overcharging Canadians. And so they're saying they're going to bring in legislation to address that. Now we'll see, the devil's always in the details, but I can tell you right now, at the dinner tables, that's what people are talking about. That's one of the things they're talking about. Those small pocketbook issues are what get people angry and fired up. The other one is healthcare. For example, for our government in 2003, healthcare was a big issue. But that was a double-edged sword as well. We assumed back then that we could raise taxes, albeit we called it a health premium, because, well, of course the public's going to support us. We need, we need more health care. All the polls were showing that. Well, of course, the public was very angry at us because we broke a promise. So the same thing that could perhaps guide you to do the right policy may misguide you politically. So there are those landmines as well.
Tim, let me follow up on the, I guess, the issue du jour, which is this notion of consumer choice and dealing with their cable packages and bundling of channels and so on. That seems to have sort of come out of, given all of the things that have been on the government's plate over the last year or so, that wasn't one of them. That seems to have come out of left field, or I guess right field in this case, wherever, very latterly. And I'm wondering, from your behind-the-scenes perspective, where does a nugget of an idea like that start? How does it get moved through? How much would public opinion factor in the moving through of that policy? Help us understand that.
Well, all of you will know the history of the Harper government in terms of the micro-targeting, and I've spoken about that it did when it came into office, or started to come in the 2004-2005 election after they lost to Mr. Martin. They got right down in the weeds and tried to identify so-called Main Street issues. They identified some of those Main Street issues in 2006, and they felt they were effective, i.e. the cut on the GST and how that affected people right at the cash register. This is another one, as Marie said, one of these pocketbook issues. The Harper government's always trolling around for pocketbook issues because they are they think these pocketbook issues, particularly the ones around cell phone bills, television service, things that people can touch, feel and see, are of immediate interest to them. You go back and you look at a lot of the stuff around 2006, you'll see the roots of this. Then you go, as you will recall, Steve, and the rest of the guests will recall, the big fight over local television a couple of years ago, the so-called fee for carriage debate. Again, you'll see again where the Harper government was fighting with both television providers and cable companies over how people were going to get their television services and whether they pay more. That elicited so much reaction, so it's not really a surprise now with the Senate scandal hanging out there to see that Harper goes back to the pocketbook as his senators are picking pockets. He's going to the pocketbook in hopes that people will forget the pickpocketing senators.
Nice line. I got to hand it to you. That's a nice line. Keith,
I try hard, buddy. I try hard.
And you succeed. But Keith, tell me, is this any more than just pandering to various, not even segments, micro segments of the community?
Well, I think it's fair to say, and maybe Tim didn't use the word pandering, clearly it's targeted. It is looking for something that politically is saleable, that might attract some more than others. But the challenge is that a government, majority government, is in governance mode, not election mode. And they may be addressing a lot of these pocketbook issues, which a lot of people as consumers would appreciate. But consumers are also citizens, and there are also bigger issues, and issues that people care about: climate change, the future of healthcare, seniors and home care. These are also issues which growing numbers of Canadians are concerned about, and we know that from research and other indications. And those are big, broad national issues which governments are also expected to address, and we tend not to see, not just at the federal level, but at the provincial level to some extent as well.
Okay, let me follow up with Stuart on that, because on the one hand we say we want governments to lead. We like strong leaders. On the other hand, part of leading is presumably finding out where the public wants you to take them, and we look down on politicians who take polls and say, oh, that's what they want, let's just give them that. How do we figure out that balance?
Well, we've been trying that ever since we came up with democracy, I guess, right? Trying to figure out how exactly you find the right balance between leading and following, how you find the right balance between representing majorities versus representing minorities. It's, I don't think it's ever easy, and we tend to, it tends to be the case that we like a government when what they do is represent the majority when we're in the majority and represent the minority when we're part of the minority. I mean, Keith's hit on an interesting point, though. I mean, when I talk about the relative success of governments over the past few decades in Canada at following general trends in public opinion, that tends to be true on a select number of highly salient issues and not on a whole bunch of others. And governments have some control over issue salience, and the throne speech is a nice example of that. Governments have an opportunity to prioritize some issues in news content, in the public mind, in government, to prioritize some issues over other issues. So there's some weird flexibility there, right? We know that governments tend to represent on issues that people are thinking about, and then on the many other issues that people are not thinking about, well, there isn't really representation. We have no particular thoughts on that. Governments are free to do what they want to do. And so now we're in a situation where government can choose to select some issues to be of high salience and then represent on those issues while simultaneously kind of being free to make up their own minds on a whole range of other issues.
Marie, let me go to you with an example of one that, using Stuart's expression, is not highly salient, and was not highly salient, but it was on your desk. And this is when you were the Minister for Democratic Reform. And one of the things that your government set up was something called the Citizens' Assembly, where they were going to get, I think it was, what, one from every riding or something? 125 or 100, whatever it was, more than 100 people from all over Ontario. Put them together for a weekend, get some experts to come in, make some presentations on how you could change our system of electing people and democracy and so on. Let them chew around these ideas and then come up with some recommendations. And they did that, and overwhelmingly got shot down. Went to the public, had a chance to vote on it, and it overwhelmingly got shot down. So you tried to do a kind of deep dive on public opinion and public engagement, and it went, I mean, at the end of the day, it was a flop, wasn't it? So was it worth it?
The product may not be what the Assembly wanted. They may have been unhappy because they were involved. It was a series of weekends, actually. It was every second weekend for 6 months. They put a lot of their personal time in there, and we had a student assembly at the same time. I could talk for hours, and you don't have time about what went wrong there, but in a nutshell, there wasn't enough time. A number of pieces of legislation had to be passed, and there wasn't enough time, in my opinion, for the public to really learn what the question of the referendum question was. I think if I had to do it all over again, I would say, if you don't give me 4 years Premier, I'm not doing it because it won't be done well. And number two, I'd probably have a yes and no campaign so that the public themselves could educate each other as opposed to Elections Ontario doing it. The whole purpose was to make it neutral. But these things don't have to be neutral. You have a yes and a no side, and you fund those, and then they can battle it out. So if I had to do it all over again, I would do it differently. Having said all that, it wasn't a huge priority for the public. It was a promise that we made, and we had broken promises. And I think the Premier and myself felt that we can't break another promise. We promised we would do this, we should do it. But it wasn't something we were hearing at the doors, certainly, that this was a big issue for Ontario, not at all. So here's one where we thought it was the right thing, and we pursued it.
This is Premier McGuinty you're talking.
Premier McGuinty, yeah.
Have you revisited this issue with him in later years?
No, I have not.
He may have other things on his mind these days.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, let's have our politics, Tim, to you on this one, have our politics ever been such? You know, there's this tendency to think that, oh, it was the golden age back when, but today it's so awful. Have the politics ever been such that politicians led and the public was content to be led because in general, we trusted that they would essentially get the policy right at the end of the day?
I think there certainly have been moments, but I go back to when I used to work for Crosby. He used to have a great quote when he was talking about the Liberals, and it was from a French philosopher whose name escapes me at the moment, and he would always haul it out, and he would say, look, think of the Liberals. Their motto is, there go the people, I must follow them. You know, you can look at people, of course, like Lincoln and Churchill and others. I think, though, where they were successful, they were able to tap into a vein and connect to the public with a certain language. I think, you know, being able to connect is an important thing. To understand the public is an important thing. I think, you know, Keith made a very good point that I just want to go back to, and it answers your question, I believe, and that's, you know, Keith was talking about the key issues of salience to the public, environment and healthcare. Well, look at the Kyoto Accord as a great example of all that. You know, many governments talked about the importance of the Kyoto Accord, its relevance, the importance of climate change, but where governments failed, and this is not a partisan comment, is communicating the why of that to the people. I think the onus is on government to be able to connect to the people through a language, through a discourse, through symbols that help them understand. That's part and parcel of leadership. So I think Stuart was talking about a form of agenda setting. I think, you know, agenda setting comes when you can use the language, and leaders that use the language well and tap into public opinion are both leading and listening, which is, I think, the hallmark of a good leader.
We actually haven't, Stuart, talked about sort of the third angle in this triangle so far. We've talked about the politicians, we've talked about the public, but of course the politicians don't just get their advice from the public, they get it from the public service as well. That bureaucracy, the civil service, that is kind of the permanent advisory group in there to help them make their decisions. What role do they play, genuinely speaking, what role do they play in getting policy from A to B to C to D at the end of the day?
Well, that's a tough general question. I mean, I guess my answer, generally speaking, like kind of looking across all policies, is that they play a pretty critical role, right? Because there are a whole range of policies that we never poll about, that we never talk about, that are very, very complex, and for which we need a whole lot of knowledge in which to use in order to make policy. So in that sense, I mean, public service is really pretty critical.
But are they supposed to care about the public's point of view on stuff when they offer their advice?
Well, I mean, I think that, I mean, normatively, yeah, I think that they are, but that's not really how the system is built. I mean, the system is built so that elected representatives are concerned about what the public, what is good for the public, what the public wants and what the public needs, and then the objective of the civil service is to try to kind of fulfill the objectives of elected representatives, or to provide the relevant information in order for elected representatives to make their decisions.
Okay, Marie, you were one of those elected representatives. Oftentimes, I'm sure, the civil service would come to you and say, on the merits, this is what you ought to do. Mm-hmm. And then you would look at a poll, or you would hear what your constituents are telling you back on the mountain in Hamilton and say, yeah, but we want you to do this. Mm-hmm. What do you do then?
Well, if you're the minister, they need to do what the people want you to do, and that is follow the minister's direction. And there were some differences of opinion, although I have to say our public service is excellent in Ontario, but there were differences of opinion.
Give us a for instance.
Okay, the child care issue, for example, funding private daycare centers and giving them money for capital expenses. Mm-hmm. And they said to me that they've always done this. Well,
the civil service
said civil service said this to me. One element of the civil service. And I said, well, that's not true. I grew up on top of a private child care center. I respect private child care centers. That's what fed me many years. My mom was a provider, but that's not true. It wasn't always the case, and I philosophically disagree with private child care centers getting capital money from the taxpayer, because they can write things off, whereas the not-profits can't, and et cetera, et cetera. So there was a disagreement, but my deputy agreed with me and told the elements that they were to follow the directive. So that's a small example. That wasn't polling. That was just, at that point in time, this particular minister knew the business a little more than perhaps that particular bureaucrat believed.
My bet is that doesn't happen very much. No. My bet is most ministers' departments know more about almost everything than most ministers.
And you're right. And another issue was the autism issue, children with autism, which was a big political issue. And in order to counter the differences of opinion, what I did at the time as minister is had experts from the province on autism give me advice and actually provide me with the policy. So that's another avenue. You've got the public opinion, you've got these experts within the civil service, then you can get external experts as well to work with the civil service to address the policy change.
Tim, help us.
I was just gonna
yeah, go ahead, please.
I mean, I don't know if it's the case in Ontario, but I've certainly seen federal memorandum to cabinets, and most cabinets, Marie would have gotten them as a minister, will have a memorandum to cabinet that's informed and provided by and written by public servants. And some of these memorandum to cabinets that I have seen in the past have had bits and pieces of information about public opinion. I remember the case, for example, of the relocation of the Innu of Labrador here in Newfoundland and Labrador, and I remember seeing a memorandum to cabinet that had different op-ed pieces of the day talking about where people were to try and give a sense and a flavor for what some of the editorial comment was, and in turn an assumption that this was some of the public comment. So I think public servants do as best they can to provide insights and direction, even in formal documents, around public opinion.
Well, if I could just add to that too, there is a history and practice in the civil service at the federal and some provincial levels of it's actually the civil service and the public servants that do public opinion polling and surveys.
Yeah, exactly.
Sometimes quite comprehensively, and it usually fit more in the public service than in ministers' offices. I'm sure Marie will agree with that. That used to be much more the case than it is today. And I think that part of the politicization of government at different levels is the public service in many levels, particularly the federal government today, is no longer doing that kind of independent, balanced public opinion research to inform ministers and policy that they used to.
Let me follow up with you. There's any number of different ways that politicians find out what the public's thinking. You want to make a bit of a checklist here, and then we'll go through which are more influential than others?
Well, politicians have to get elected. They have to listen to their constituents and voters. They have to listen to their riding association. So they have all kinds of networks into the public and populace in terms of being a politician. There's the media, which may not be an accurate representation of public opinion, but people in the media have a sense of what's salient, what sells. So that's another layer of what the public is thinking and what's important. Then you've got research, which is, I guess, a third leg, so to speak. And it's different from the other two, but it's unique in the sense that it's research. It's based on social scientific principles. And you're talking to individual citizens privately for their own opinion without the benefit of others influencing them, and you're collecting that into a common view. And the political scientist Sidney Verba made a very interesting comment once. He said that surveys produce exactly what democracy is supposed to produce: equal representation of every citizen.
Okay, Marie, so you've got constituents, you've got the riding association, the political apparatus, if you like, you've got the media, which is going to give you advice, you've got public opinion polling. For all we know, you got a spouse who you end up with at the end of the day who says something in your ear that might be very influential. How would you rank those? What's the most important, I guess, place to find out where you think the public's at on an issue?
Well, I think first we have to remind ourselves that all politics are local. So your constituents are your number one. And again, that when you're a politician, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. If you represent your constituents and go to bat with them against your own government, you might be a hero for a short term, but then slowly the conversation changes and they say, oh, she doesn't have any influence anymore. She'll be booted out of cabinet pretty soon. And sometimes that does happen in our parliamentary system. So I think constituents are very important. Also your colleagues, because you have your own, in my case, Hamilton-based perceptions of an issue or a proposed piece of legislation, but then you hear from your colleagues from the rural ridings, oh, but Marie, do you know what that's going to do to me in my riding? You have to hear all the perspectives. As well now, I think it's even more, I want to say helpful, but it can also be challenging that you have social media and you know what things are trending. I think it was on this very show years ago in 2007 when I just left politics, when the new government of McGuinty wanted to change the laws for young drivers and be very restrictive. Social media was new back then as far as tweeting and Facebook, and there was a barrage I think tens of thousands of young people saying, do you know what this will do in the rural areas where we drive each other around? And the government did back down a little bit. So I think there's an added pressure point now for politicians, which can be very positive, but can also be very, it can be full of conflict as well if you have divisive views.
Well, that's it. Tim, again, help us understand. If it's a case of a public opinion poll saying one thing, but the member is back in the riding and the constituents overwhelmingly say another thing, who wins?
Generally, those in the riding, though, you try and twin the two. I mean, you think of key leaders within communities, within the ridings. I mean, fire chiefs, union leaders, ministers in some cases, you name it, hockey coaches. You listen to these people because they're each receptacles of public opinion from different sources. And if you're a good politician, you have a trap line to go out and listen to all these people. But there's some great stories about this federal replacement workers bill, which you all will know was kicking around the federal parliament for 11 or 12 years. It would come back as a private members bill. One of the large unions in this country who was opposed to it went out and got riding by riding polls of those who were supporting the bill, went and met these MPs and showed them how one poll in their riding would change if they voted against this bill. They were able to move 20 conservatives from supportive to against this bill by going right into the riding, talking to people and polling people within the riding on a poll-by-poll basis. So I think it's a mixture of the two, Steve. I don't think you can just separate them as some might suggest.
Gotcha. Well, Keith, we have one of the best examples of sort of policy development based on not necessarily the merits, but public opinion and public opinion polling right here in the capital city of Ontario right now with the Scarborough subway.
Yes.
All the studies over the years have led people to believe, or led, I guess, on the, how do we put this? That the argument on the merits is that there are other priorities ahead of a Scarborough subway that ought to be taken care of, but City Council in its wisdom decided to go for the Scarborough subway because the mayor's made it an issue, other people running for mayor have made it an issue, people in Scarborough have made it an issue, the Liberal caucus at Queen's Park that represents Scarborough's made it an issue. Is this a good news story because politics actually responded to pressure, or is this a bad news story because it flew in the face of what the facts are saying?
Well, you know, I think it's actually difficult to tell at this point in time. Certainly everybody's got an opinion about it. But the one thing that I found particularly absent from this whole debate was a clear, objective, unbiased view of the people of Scarborough, who supposedly are everybody's focus, and everybody arguing about what the people of Scarborough need, what they deserve. And a lot of the arguments were around what's best for the people of Scarborough. And I didn't see any surveys, any public opinion research done independently that actually effectively looked at this and asked Scarborough residents, here are the options, here's what's involved, what do you think? That told us really what collectively all the people of Scarborough wanted. It may have been consensus in one direction or another, or it may have been divided.
Well, Stuart,
we don't know.
Would that kind of information have been useful at all anyway, Stuart? I mean, if you took a poll and said, people in Scarborough, do you want a subway? I mean, who'd say no to that, right? So how useful is that kind of information anyway?
Well, I think it's always useful to know what people want. That doesn't necessarily mean that you prioritize what a majority wants over what you as a politician, let's say, as a minister may know actually is better. I mean, that's when you that's when you have this difficulty. Do you do what the majority wants regardless of whether it makes sense or not? There's no easy answer for that. I suppose that's when you try to take those facts and make those things apparent to the people you're interviewing, right? And that's partly what Keith is talking about. You want not just independent polling, but you want polls that are well done, that are well written. You can use a poll to convey information and then get more informed public opinion back. Maybe that's the way to go.
But Marie, as long as I've watched politics, people want more of everything, and they want to pay less for it. Everybody knows that. So where's the, there's no mystery in this in some respects, right?
No, they want everything as long as it's not in their backyard, if it's messy. And
like gas plants.
Like gas plants. And B, although they do want a better climate and better health care for their future grandchildren.
And cheaper hydro.
And cheaper hydro. But if it's in their backyard and if they have the perception that it affects their value of their home, they'll go against it. And so, yes, I would say in a democracy, the citizens at the end have the accountability. They can boot out the politicians every 4 years, or sooner in some cases in minority governments. But in the end, they have to pay attention to the issues and the whole issue, not just what affects them. But I can tell you, that's the politician in me speaking. The psychologist in me speaking will say, but it's very human to care about yourself, your family, and at the most, maybe your neighbor. That's very human, and it's really the highly advanced and wonderful people of the world that go beyond themselves and think of everyone else but themselves. That kind of sacrifice, that kind of leadership is rare.
As Lincoln said, appealing to the better angels in us all. There's not
right.
much of that out there anymore, is there?
I think people like to think there is. I mean, politicians really, I have not met any politician, and I mean this sincerely, that didn't think he or she was doing the right thing. And I say that with all sincerity. But when you're in there, in the legislature, in the House of Commons, I presume, you really are influenced by the politics of the place and places. You really are. You really are influenced by your colleagues. You're influenced by the polls. You are influenced. Because again, that is human. But I've never met anyone that thinks they're doing something that isn't good for the public. Not one person.
Let's give the ex-politician the last word on this program. Thanks to Tim Powers on the line from St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. Tim, always appreciate your contributions to the program. Stuart Soroka, the political science professor at McGill University in Montreal. Marie Butriani, the former Ontario cabinet minister, now interim dean at Ryerson Universities. G. Raymond Chang, School of Continuing Education, and Keith Newman, the executive director of the Environics Institute. Thanks so much, everybody. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.